So welcome to the latest episode of Growth Ripples podcast, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the director of White Ribbon, so Allan. Allan, it's a pleasure to have you part of the call and to have a bit of a chat today.
Oh, thanks, Jan. Thanks for having me and hosting me today.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. We've spoken a little bit over the last few weeks, and as I mentioned before, Allan, it's been a cause close to my heart. I actually had an ex-friend, I should say, a friend, very much a friend, but used to be an employee of White Ribbon many years ago, and I definitely follow what you're doing on various platforms, including LinkedIn. So it's a real pleasure to be able to chat with you today. And what I was hoping to have a discussion with you around was, particularly what men can do more about in this space, particularly from the angle, because what I see, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well on this, Allan, but I hear a lot around the good intentions that people have and that, not all men are bad, which is obviously true, but at the same time, intent often doesn't mean actually a positive impact. Like, I'm kind of keen to hear your thoughts on that, and how do you see that playing out in this area of ending domestic violence and ending violence against women?
Well, firstly, I needed just to acknowledge Ghana country and pay my respects to elders past and present. So we're recording from Ghana country today.
Thank you, Allan.
Yeah, no, it's really important because sovereignty was never ceded. It always was and always will be their country. The fact that two men are talking about family violence and what we can do about it is pretty taboo, right? And this is exactly what we need to be doing. We need to collectively raise the bar for Australian men about what it means to be connected to the issue of women's safety. It's not enough anymore for us just to say, hey, I'm not physically violent, so therefore it's not an issue that I need to bother about. For far too long, women, children and victims have been doing the heavy lifting. And they've been asked to solve violence, which is actually happening to them. So we need to have a new conversation in Australia, and that is what is the role of men and what are men going to do about it? Because it's not a women's issue, it's a men's issue too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just on that last point, that really resonates for me, talking about it not being a women's issue, not being a minorities issue, not being a marginalised people issue. It's definitely a men's issue, because in terms of when violence is perpetrated against women or marginalized people, we know the stats very clearly is men are the main perpetrators. It doesn't mean that you or I are perpetrating it, but if we don't stand up to it, if we don't actually call it out, in some respects, we're not being that much better, in my view. What are your thoughts there?
Well, men are in a really strong position to call out other men to account for their actions. And it is right now the situation where men currently control most of the resources required to affect the change and the systemic changes that are required. So they're integral to be involved, not only in the relationships and solutions that promote gender equality, they're integral to be involved to do something in all of their interactions in their networks. So when men say, well, what can I do about it? Well, it starts first and foremost with, are you aware of the issue? We, in White Ribbon Australia, we talk to men frequently. And in fact, over the last 13, 14 weeks, we've had 3,000 young men engage in our youth program. You can ask that. So we've got insights from 13 to 15-year-olds. And they are genuinely curious about gender equality and what they can do about it. How do they be a really good bystander and call out a friend who's sharing a sexist remark or joke? They are genuinely confused about social media influencers like Andrew Tate and how do they respond to him online. And they are so ill-informed about technology-facilitated abuse. So there is so much work that we need to be doing. And what we've done as a community is we've shamed men. We haven't relatively called them in and connected them to this issue. So men are most likely to be a perpetrator of violence and abuse. And it doesn't matter if you're female, male, a child, trans, fluid in your gender, 97% of sexual assault, rape, is perpetrated by man. So men have to be accountable to that. And on the other flip side, the majority of men in Australia are not violent, abusive, or disrespectful. but they're absent in actions.
Yes.
They are silent on the issue, and that is contributing to why violence is thriving.
You touched on something there about, the tendency to shame men around this. Can you talk a bit more about that? I'm keen to understand, what's the alternative to get some real behavioral change in this area?
We need to call men in. So that fundamentally is the shift there. So by pointing a finger and saying, oh, men, you are wrong, how bad you are, naughty, stop doing it, that's not going to create a sense of change. I'm a clinician, and one of the things that I really fundamentally believe in is the research of positive behavior support, and that is reinforcing positive behaviors. So if we demonstrate and role model to other men what good, ethical, kind, compassionate practice and relationships look like, they will reciprocate. It's part of that human condition around mirroring other people's behaviors and attitudes. And we've heard the terms around toxic masculinity, and I hate that term because there are multiple forms of masculinity. And when we do uphold a single version of one or idolize one over the others, that's when we unravel.
Yeah.
So we can challenge that too as men. We can say, we've heard the sayings, boys should be boys, boys don't cry, male breadwinner, treat her mean to keep her keen. What we're actually conveying there is there's a certain type of man, and that is not hurting, that's hurting women and children, but it's also hurting men.
Absolutely. I mean, I think about, similarly, I don't like that toxic masculinity sort of term. I also think about this kind of very stereotyped versions of what masculinity are. They definitely don't help men at all. I think about, the kind of father that I want to be, that I try to be, often what that is in the kind of social media or in the mainstream media is not necessarily synonymous with being caring, looking after your children beyond just the financial means, but also on that emotional sort of sense. And just making some small pivots I've found with my son, being able to help him open up and not be afraid to cry and, that kind of mentality. And he hears it from school at a very young age, even though he's in, I would say, more of a, not alternative, but just a school that allows for more demonstration of emotion. But there's already that shame I can see from what messages he's picked up from others. So it must start at such a young age. And you talked before about doing a number of surveys for young men. Where do you see from your experience, where does it start in terms of this view of, masculinity and potentially perpetrating violence? Where does that start from your perspective?
From conception. The first 1,000 days, the way that we set up a child's life, we are equipping children effectively with constructions around what it means to be a boy or a girl. So gender constructs start right from birth. Now, we have to, of course, appreciate that they're a developmental lens, and we have to also respect that different cultural intersections play a significant role in how this play out. So I'm speaking more generally here. But ultimately, we still have a society that suggests a certain role of boys and a certain role of girls. And gender inequality is one of the main driving or triggering factors for family violence. So when we do talk to young boys particularly, they are genuinely curious about the issue. And we, as Australia, beyond the national curriculum changes around respect for relationships, we're not tuning into what they actually want to learn about. I mean, let's take example. Let's look at Andrew Tate, who's a social influencer, and I've publicly commented on him previously. I don't necessarily feel that banning individuals and stopping them from speaking is going to solve the problem. However, one of the things that comes up frequently, and probably more so in the last 6 months in my engagements with young men, is this individual. And what I do is, because I talk to fathers too, and I say, well, don't shut down the conversation. Genuinely ask young men, your boys, your sons, your grandkids, ask them, what is it about Andrew Tate that draws you to him? And often what young people say, there's two things that come up. One thing is, well, he speaks the truth. And so that gives you an opportunity to understand, well, what do you mean the truth? And then the other thing is, because my other mates are watching it, I want to see what this is about. So this is genuine curiosity. Now, I've had some criticism myself and around talking about Andrew Tate, because I've been told, well, by talking about him, you're giving him a spotlight and giving him attention. And my commentary back to that is the boat has already sailed. Young people are switched on. They're tuned in. And if it's not Andrew Tate, it's Jordan Peterson and other internet personalities online. Young people are engaged on their phone.
Yes.
They're engaged on these devices more so than they're engaged probably in that kind of real world conversations. So as much as we put something out on Facebook or on mainstream media, the reality is young people have got platforms that they engage on, that they connect with. And these are platforms which are a toxic breeding ground of some insidious thoughts and attitudes, which of course will result in behavior, influence in behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very interesting what you're saying there, and, using Andrew Tate as an example. I mean, I also think back to kind of sex education and consent, and, often like looking at, say, what the US has tended to do as an example is, like, oh, just abstain and that will solve the problem. But to me, that's similar to what you're saying around if people are telling you, just ignore Andrew Tate, but that's ignoring, sure, they might not get as much attention, but if we don't address it, perhaps people will take it as gospel. And I even think about, where pornography is and a lot of kids getting education around sex from pornography. I'm concerned about my own son. He's not yet at that age where he's thankfully getting exposed to it yet, but I'm sure it's not too far off. And that kind of, I want to make sure I'm having conversations with him about that's not normal, healthy sex in terms of what you see in pornography, because so much of it is becoming more violent, becoming less about consent. And unless we have those conversations, young people are going to come to their own conclusions. So we're better off educating them and hopefully they make the right choices, because parents aren't going to be there all of the time. All that we can do, I think, is help educate and understand what it means to be, good quality male, female, whatever, or whatever gender, that someone, affiliates themselves with. That is what's more important at the core of an individual. I mean, the other piece I'm keen to hear from your experience, because obviously you've talked quite a bit about, kids and about, men and women. What about in the workplace? Like, what are you seeing? Because I imagine you partner with a number of workplaces. What are you seeing there in terms of what the better workplaces are doing to address some of these concerns?
White Ribbon Australia has a really robust workplace program, which looks at training and development for employees across Australia in a range of issues, from sexual discrimination through to gender equality practice and developing domestic violence policies. We have one of the world's leading, Australia's Australia's only accreditation process that looks holistically at a variety of areas in workplaces to check on its hygiene and to highlight the gaps in that. So we can speak with a sense of authority here. We have well over 200 workplaces that are currently accredited. We have a reach of over 300,000 employees that we talk to every day. And where we see workplaces doing really well is those workplaces that are not subscribing to the notion that it's a destination, that it's a journey. And what I mean by that is gender equality, reducing violence and discrimination in the workplace. It's going to require a long-term complex commitment to doing it. So it's not just a tick and a flick exercise to say, hey, I've got a policy, it's done. It's really robustly forensically looking at all of your systems and structures which create culture in the workplace. So some of the best examples of workplaces that are doing it really well are those workplaces that lead from the top, that have shareholder back-in or support, and workplaces that are genuinely committed to community engagement and civic engagement around the issue of men's violence towards women and reducing it.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I guess we've also seen in the legal landscape and employment law around domestic violence leave, which is, I guess, a positive step. And the other thing I guess we're seeing as well is around sexual harassment, with the federal government recently announcing, and I think that's now passed off the top of my head, but it's passed in terms of being new legislation and the obligation on employers to protect. The other thing that I'm hearing a lot around at the moment is NDAs, and particularly NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements around when there's been a case of harassment, what are your thoughts on that in terms of the current landscape?
The current landscape is one that gives me a sense of hope, and probably for the first time in a long time, because when I look at what Victoria has led in terms of positive duty to prevent workplace sexual harassment, and the work that they're doing, because they're ahead of the rest of Australia at this point in time, the work that they're doing, there are some promising outcomes. Now, we will have in 2023 an implementation stage where workplaces will be mandated under law to ensure that their workplaces are ones of respect and upholding that in every element of design. And they'll also have the Australian Human Rights Commission that will have a bit of oversight and a bit more grit in terms of holding organisations to account. But it shouldn't take legislation. This is common sense stuff. Like, if you go to work, you should not be sexually harassed. If you go to work, you should not be bullied or experience violence. When you go to work, you shouldn't be afraid to put up your hand for promotion, and you shouldn't be around a board table or in around a meeting room and be afraid to say, "Oh, I'm pregnant. I need to take some leave," and think that might destroy my career.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have an Australia or a world that promotes this, and unfortunately, it does.
Absolutely.
So Australian businesses are put on notice. And it's not a bad thing, and it's not scary, and it shouldn't be fearful, because the great thing is there is individuals and organisations that are here to support you. There is the expertise. There are other workplaces that are doing it really well, and we should be sharing and being really transparent as a global community of practice.
Absolutely. I mean, I've worked in this space for quite a long time, as you probably know, Alan. 17 years in HR, and very strong on or passionate about stopping and helping organizations prevent bullying, harassment, and discrimination. And what I notice in those employers and those leaders that actually want to do the right thing, they actually look and lead from an area of transparency. So as an example, like, I was quite buoyed by the fact that Telstra already came out and said they'll no longer require someone to sign an NDA if they're sexually harassed. And I think that's a good start. I'd love to see that also apply to bullying, discrimination, and any other kind of grievance that's related. But I'd love to see other organizations following that lead, because I think that transparency, if we learn from it, because no organization is perfect, but if we can learn from it and actually apply those learnings so that we make every organization safer every day, and that, our future generations are actually going to places where actually bullying and harassment, discrimination, they're actually redundant. They don't happen anymore. I mean, that's kind of the dream. We might never get there in our lifetimes, but if we keep focusing on that, like you said before, it's not a destination. It's an ongoing sort of conversation, an ongoing process and journey. Then I think, we will result in having better workplaces for our people.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And thank you for doing the work that you do as well in human resource practice. We need to continue to have many yarns of the world.
Thanks, Allan. That's very kind of you to say. Thank you. Look, I'm conscious of time. We're probably kind of getting towards the end. Are there any final remarks that you're keen to make, just for anyone listening and wanting to learn more about how we can stop violence against women and just violence in general from the work that you're doing?
If there's any men that are listening to this, know that you have a role to play. And that role is not scary, and it shouldn't be one that causes you a sense of anxiety. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, but lean into that discomfort, because I tell you what's unsafe is a woman fearing for her life, a child fearing for their safety. So call out sexism if you see it. If you've got the ability, rewrite policies and practices to ensure they promote gender equality in the workplace. Share parenting responsibilities at home. Role model respect in your relationships and your interactions. Be a better bystander. Because if you genuinely see a mate struggling, go up to them and ask them, how are you going? How can I genuinely help? The end goal of all of our work is to create a nation free of violence. And that, what we're talking about there, is a nation that promotes safety, kindness, and compassion.
Yeah, well, wow, what a powerful finish, Allan. I mean, one thing just to echo, I really love that message that you have about, it's essentially it's okay to feel uncomfortable by these topics and these conversations, but it's not okay to stand by and let them happen. So, yeah, I really want to thank you, Allan, for coming on the podcast, and looking forward to continuing to follow the great work that you're doing with White Ribbon.
Thanks so much.
Cheers.